At the grocery store, I paid $45 for an elderly woman's groceries because her card was declined. Instead of saying thank you, she grabbed my wrist with a grip of steel, leaned in close, and whispered, "When your son Patrick leaves tonight, do not touch the snow in your backyard. Just watch it." I laughed it off, thinking she was senile, but 20 minutes later, out in the freezing parking lot, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My broke son, who had begged me for rent money that morning, was handing a thick envelope of cash to a man with a prison tattoo on his neck. "My name is Thomas Strickland. I am 72 years old, and I spent 40 years building half the foundations in this town. I thought I had earned a quiet retirement, but I was about to find out that the house I built was sitting on a sinkhole of lies. If you have ever felt like the people you sacrificed everything for are treating you like a fool, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what city you are watching from." The automatic doors of the Walmart in Grand Rapids blasted a wave of heat that smelled like stale popcorn and wet wool. It was 5 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and the news had been screaming about a blizzard coming down from Canada all day. People were panicking. The shelves were half empty, stripped of bread and milk. I stood in line clutching a carton of eggs and a bag of coffee beans, feeling the ache in my lower back. Years of pouring concrete and hauling lumber leave their mark on you, and today the drop in barometric pressure made my joints feel like rusty hinges. In front of me was a woman I recognized from the neighborhood. Mrs. Gable. She lived 2 houses down. She was a quiet woman, maybe 75, always wearing the same faded gray coat. I watched as she swiped her debit card. The machine let out a harsh buzz. Declined. She looked at the cashier, a young girl with purple hair who was clearly exhausted. Mrs. Gable's hands were shaking. She tried again. Buzz. Declined. I saw the line behind us getting restless. A guy in a heavy jacket sighed loudly, checking his watch. I could see the humiliation rising in Mrs. Gable's neck, turning her skin blotchy and red. She started to put a loaf of bread back onto the conveyor belt, her voice trembling as she whispered that she would just take the cat food. I did not think twice. I stepped forward and tapped my card on the reader. "Put it all on my tab," I told the cashier. It was only $45.16. To some people, that is nothing. To a pensioner on a fixed income, it is the difference between eating dinner or going to bed hungry. Mrs. Gable froze. She looked at the screen, then turned to look at me. Her eyes were watery blue, magnified by her thick glasses. I expected a nod or a simple thanks. That is how we do things in Michigan. We help out and we move on. We do not make a scene. But Mrs. Gable did not move on. She waited until I had bagged my coffee. When we walked toward the exit, away from the crowds, she suddenly reached out and grabbed my forearm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Her fingers dug into my winter jacket. "Mr. Strickland," she said. Her voice was low, urgent. I smiled, trying to be polite. "It is okay, Mrs. Gable. Stay warm out there." She shook her head violently. "No, listen to me. You have to listen. I see things from my window. I am old, but I am not blind." I stopped walking. The automatic doors were opening and closing, letting in gusts of freezing wind, but she held me there in the vestibule. "What are you talking about?" I asked. She looked around as if she was afraid someone was listening. Then she leaned up on her tiptoes. "Patrick, your son. When he leaves the house tonight, do not go out there, but look at the snow in the yard, specifically near the old shed." I frowned. Patrick was staying with me temporarily while he got his construction business back on its feet, or so he said. "What about the snow?" I asked, feeling a little impatient. "Just do not touch it," she hissed. "Do not touch the snow. Just watch it. And be careful, Thomas. There are snakes in your garden, and they are hungry." Before I could ask her what on earth she meant, she let go of my arm and hurried out into the parking lot, her head down against the wind. I stood there for a moment watching her go. I shook my head. Poor woman, I thought. Living alone like that must mess with your head. Snakes in the snow. It was 10 degrees below zero. There were no snakes. I zipped up my jacket and walked out into the cold. The wind hit me like a physical blow. The snow was already starting to fall sideways, stinging my cheeks. I navigated through the slush towards my truck. I drove a 10-year-old Chevy Silverado, reliable and sturdy just like me. I was fumbling for my keys when a movement 2 rows over caught my eye. It was a black Ford F-350 with a lift kit and chrome rims. I knew that truck. I bought that truck 3 years ago. It was the company vehicle for Strickland Construction, when I retired and handed the business over to my son Patrick. I gave him the keys to that truck along with a debt-free company and a list of loyal clients. I paused. Patrick had told me this morning that he was going to a job site in Detroit to bid on a renovation project. Detroit was 2 hours east. Why was he here at the local Walmart? Maybe he stopped for supplies, I told myself. But the truck was parked in the furthest corner of the lot, away from the entrance, near the recycling dumpsters. It was idling. I wiped the snow off my glasses and squinted. The driver's side window rolled down. I saw Patrick. I would recognize that profile anywhere, even in the dim light of the street lamps. He looked nervous. He was checking his rearview mirror. Then a man stepped out from behind the dumpster. He was wearing a hooded sweatshirt, despite the freezing cold. He walked up to the truck window. I could not see his face clearly, but I saw the tattoo on his neck, a dark spiderweb design that usually meant time served in prison. My heart started to thump, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Patrick did not hand him a receipt or a clipboard. Patrick reached under the seat and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was thick enough to be cash. A lot of cash. My mind flashed back to breakfast this morning. Patrick sitting at my kitchen table, head in his hands, telling me he was behind on his truck payments. Telling me he needed to borrow $2,000 just to keep the lights on at his office. He had looked so defeated, so pathetic. I had almost written him the check. But the man in the truck window was not acting like a man who was broke. He was acting like a man who was making a payoff. The guy in the hoodie took the envelope, flipped through it quickly, and nodded. He slapped the roof of the truck twice, then turned and vanished back into the shadows behind the dumpsters. Patrick rolled the window up immediately. He put the truck in gear and peeled out of the parking spot, fishtailing slightly on the ice before speeding toward the exit. He did not see me standing there next to my old Chevy clutching a bag of coffee beans. I stood frozen in the parking lot, and it was not because of the cold. A sick feeling began to spread in my stomach. It was the gut instinct I had developed over 40 years in the construction business. The instinct that told you when a wall was about to collapse or when a subcontractor was cutting corners. Mrs. Gable's words echoed in my head. There are snakes in your garden. I had dismissed her as a senile old lady, but I had just watched my son, who claimed to be penniless, hand over what looked like $5,000 to a criminal in a Walmart parking lot. I got into my truck and slammed the door. My hands were shaking as I put the key in the ignition. I was not shaking from fear. I was shaking from rage. I did not know what was happening in my house or what was buried under the snow in my yard. But as I drove home through the blinding white storm, I made a promise to myself. I was going to find out. And if Patrick was playing me for a fool, he was going to learn that the old man still knew how to bring down the house. I pulled out of the lot, my headlights cutting through the swirling snow. The drive home usually took 10 minutes. Tonight it felt like I was driving into a war zone. When I turned onto my street, the neighborhood was dark and quiet, buried under a fresh blanket of white. I pulled into my driveway. The house looked peaceful. Warm yellow light spilled from the kitchen windows. To anyone passing by, it looked like the perfect American home. But as I stepped out of the truck, I looked toward the backyard. The privacy fence was tall, but through the gaps I could see the dark shape of the old tool shed. and around it the snow was smooth and white. Perfect, untouched, or so it seemed. I walked up the porch steps, stamping the snow off my boots. I reached for the door handle, ready to confront my son. But then I stopped. No. If I walked in there shouting, he would just lie. He was good at lying. He had been lying to me for a long time, apparently. I needed proof. I needed to see what Mrs. Gable saw. I opened the front door and stepped into the warmth of the hallway. "Hey, Dad, is that you?" Patrick's voice called out from the living room. It was cheerful, relaxed, not the voice of a man who just made a shady deal in a parking lot. "Yeah, it is me," I called back, hanging up my coat. The heavy fabric felt like armor. "Did you get the coffee?" he asked, walking into the hall. He was wearing a sweater and holding a mug of cocoa. He looked like an innocent child. "Yeah, I got it." I looked him right in the eye. I looked for the stress. I looked for the guilt. But he just smiled, that charming smile that used to get him out of trouble when he was a teenager. "Great, Megan is making dinner. We are celebrating." Celebrating what I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Oh, just a new contract." Finally got some good news. I gripped the bag of coffee beans so hard the plastic crinkled. A lie. Another lie. "That is good, son," I said. "I am tired. I am going to wash up." I walked past him toward the stairs. But as I passed, I glanced down at his boots by the door. They were wet, and stuck to the heel of his left boot was a piece of red clay. There is no red clay in our yard, but there is red clay at the old industrial park on the edge of town, the place where the police found those stolen copper wires last month. I climbed the stairs one by one. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. Mrs. Gable was right. The snow was hiding something. And tonight, when everyone was asleep, I was going to find out what it was. I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, washing the red clay off my hands, even though they were already clean. I needed a moment to compose myself before facing the wolves in my living room. This house used to be my sanctuary. I built it with my own 2 hands 30 years ago. I laid every brick and sanded every floorboard. It was a place of peace where my wife and I raised our son. But now, as I walked back down the hallway, the air felt heavy and suffocating. It did not smell like lemon polish and old wood anymore. It smelled of cheap perfume and stale cigarette smoke. The living room was unrecognizable. When Patrick and Megan asked to move in a month ago because of their financial troubles, I expected them to bring a few suitcases. Instead, they had turned my home into a storage unit. There were cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling, blocking the windows and cutting off the natural light. I had to navigate a maze of clutter just to get to my favorite armchair. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, Megan was waiting for me. She did not ask how my day was. She did not ask why I was standing in the dark. She was leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen, blocking my path with her arms crossed. "Did you find them yet?" she asked. Her voice was sharp. "Find what?" I asked, walking past her toward the kitchen counter. I wanted water. My throat was dry from the nerves. "The deed and the shed keys. Thomas, we talked about this." She rolled her eyes as if speaking to a child. "Patrick needs to organize his equipment. We cannot keep living out of boxes. We need access to the shed, and we need to get that paperwork signed for the insurance. You keep forgetting." I poured a glass of water and took a slow sip. I looked at her. Megan was wearing a silk blouse that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. For 2 people who were supposedly bankrupt, they certainly had a lot of expensive things. "I did not forget Megan," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I just have not gotten around to it. The shed is full of my old tools. I need to clear it out first." She let out a frustrated sigh. "Well, hurry up. Patrick is getting stressed. You do not want to see him stressed." As if on cue, the back door slammed open. The wind from the blizzard howled into the kitchen before the door was kicked shut. Patrick stomped in. He had been outside, maybe in the garage or checking on his precious truck. The charm he had displayed 10 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a dark, manic energy. His face was flushed red from the cold, or maybe from something else. He was muttering to himself, cursing about the snow and the cold. He did not even look at me. He just tore off his heavy coat and threw it onto the kitchen table, knocking over the salt shaker. "Get out of the way," he snapped at the air. Buster. My 12-year-old golden retriever was sleeping on his rug by the radiator. Buster was deaf and half-blind. He was the gentlest soul in this house. He did not hear Patrick come in. He just lifted his head and let out a soft, welcoming woof. Patrick did not step over him. He did not walk around him. With a snarl of pure malice, Patrick pulled his boot back and kicked the old dog in the ribs. "Move, you useless mutt!" Patrick shouted. Buster yelped, a sound of pure pain and confusion that tore through my heart. He scrambled up his paws, sliding on the linoleum, trying to get away, his tail tucked between his legs. "Hey!" I roared. The glass of water in my hand shook. "Do not you ever touch my dog again!" Patrick spun around. His eyes were wild. He looked surprised to see me there, as if he had forgotten I existed in my own house. "Then teach him to stay out of the way, old man," he spat back. "This place is a dump. Everything here is old and broken. The dog, the house, you." Megan placed a hand on his arm, but she did not look shocked. She looked annoyed that I was making a scene. "Come on, honey, calm down," she cooed. "He is just cranky. Come sit down." I ordered pizza. Pizza. They had money for takeout, but not for rent. I wanted to throw him out. I wanted to grab him by the collar and drag him into the snow. But I remembered the camera hidden in the screw head of the light switch. I remembered the text messages. I remembered the man with the spiderweb tattoo. I needed to be smart. I needed to be the rock, not the river. I knelt down and checked Buster. He was shaking, but he seemed okay. I stroked his ears, whispering that he was a good boy. When I stood up, I wore a mask of defeat. "I am sorry," I said quietly. "I will keep him in my room from now on." Patrick snorted and sat down at the table, pulling a slice of pizza from the box. "Yeah, you do that. And find those keys, Dad. I am tired of waiting." I sat opposite them. The smell of pepperoni and grease turned my stomach. We ate in silence. The only sound was the wind rattling the window panes and the aggressive chewing of my son. I watched him. I watched the way his hands moved. They were not the hands of a worker anymore. They were soft manicured, but his fingernails were dirty with grease and that same red clay. So I said, breaking the silence, "How was the meeting in Detroit? Did you get the bid?" Patrick froze mid-chew. He glanced at Megan, then back at his plate. "Yeah, it went great. Big project, high-rise renovation. That is why I need the shed. To store the materials. Construction materials for a high-rise in my backyard shed." The lie was so lazy it was insulting. "That sounds promising," I said. "Yeah, well, it is going to make us rich," Patrick said with a mouthful of food. "Then we can finally get out of this hellhole and put you in a nice facility. Somewhere they can take care of you properly. A facility. A nursing home. That was their plan. Get the house, get the money, lock the old man away." I reached for the pepper shaker, and as I did, I clumsily knocked my fork onto the floor. "Oops," I muttered. "Let me get that." I bent down under the table. Patrick did not move. As I reached for the fork, my eyes caught something sticking out of the pocket of his discarded coat, which was hanging off the back of his chair. It was a heavy brass key ring. It slipped out as the coat shifted and hit the floor with a heavy metallic clink. Patrick did not hear it over the sound of his own chewing. I reached out and grabbed the keys. I held them in my palm for a split second, examining them in the shadow of the table. These were not house keys. These were not car keys. There were 3 keys on the ring. One was a standard padlock key, but the other 2 were distinct. They had triangular heads and were stamped with a serial number and a brand name. Caterpillar. I knew these keys. I had carried a set just like them for 40 years. These were master ignition keys for heavy construction machinery. Excavators, bulldozers, loaders. You cannot buy these at a hardware store. You have to be a licensed operator or a site foreman to have them. And even then, you only have the key for your specific machine. But this was a master set, a skeleton key for heavy equipment. Possession of these keys by someone who was not an authorized dealer or active contractor was a felony in this state. It was a burglary tool. These were the keys used by professional thieves to steal equipment from job sites in the middle of the night. My heart hammered against my ribs. The puzzle pieces slammed together. The man in the parking lot. The red clay. The money. The sudden need for my shed. Patrick was not bidding on jobs. He was stealing the machines. And he was going to turn my property into a chop shop. I palmed the keys, shoving them deep into my sock under the table. I grabbed my fork and sat back up. "Did you drop something?" Patrick asked, looking at me suspiciously. "Just my fork," I said. My voice was steady. Deadly steady. I looked at my son. I looked at the grease on his chin. I looked at the arrogance in his eyes. He thought he was the predator. He thought I was the prey. He did not know that he had just dropped the smoking gun right at my feet. I finished my water and stood up. "I am going to bed," I said. "I have a headache." "Good," Patrick said, not looking up. "Do not forget to check the shed in the morning." "Oh, I will," I said. "I promise you, son, I will check everything." I walked out of the kitchen with Buster limping at my heels. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom and locked the door. I took the keys out of my sock and held them under the lamp. The metal glinted cold and hard. I pulled out my phone. I did not call the police. Not yet. I needed to see what these keys opened. I needed to see exactly what was under those tarps in the snow. I sat in the dark, watching the feed from the camera I had hidden in the living room downstairs. Patrick and Megan were laughing now. They were opening a bottle of wine. "He is so stupid," Megan said. "He actually believed the nursing home thing." Patrick laughed a cruel sound. "Let him believe it. Once he signs those papers next week, he will not have a choice. We will dump him at Shady Acres and sell this place for parts." I watched them toast to my destruction. I gripped the master key in my hand until it cut into my skin. "Enjoy your wine," I whispered to the screen, "because tomorrow the hangover is going to be hell." That night, I did not sleep. The darkness in my bedroom felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Outside, the wind was still howling, tearing at the shingles of the roof, but underneath the gale I heard something else. It was a sound that most people would have missed or mistaken for the furnace kicking on. But I knew that sound. It was the low, rhythmic chug of a diesel engine idling, a big one. I lay there with my eyes wide open, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. My hand was clenched around the master key I had stolen from Patrick's pocket. Every time the floorboards creaked in the hallway, I tensed up, waiting for my bedroom door to burst open. I was not afraid of my son physically. I was afraid of what he had become. The boy I had taught to fish and ride a bike was gone. In his place was a stranger who kicked dogs and stole from his own father. Around 3 in the morning, the engine noise stopped. I heard the back door slam shut, then heavy footsteps dragging up the stairs. Then silence. I waited until the sun began to bleed through the curtains before I moved. The storm had finally broken. The light coming into the room was blindingly white, reflecting off the fresh snow. It looked like a perfect winter morning. Peaceful, clean. But I knew it was all a lie. I got out of bed and dressed in silence. I put on my thermal layers, my heavy work pants, and my old Carhartt jacket. It was stiff with age and smelled of sawdust and oil. It was my armor. I pulled on my insulated boots and grabbed a pair of leather work gloves from the dresser. I opened my bedroom door and listened. The house was quiet. Patrick and Megan were likely sleeping off the wine and the adrenaline of whatever they had been doing last night. I crept down the stairs, skipping the third step that always squeaked. Buster was waiting for me at the bottom, his tail thumping softly against the floor. I put a finger to my lips, and he seemed to understand. He stayed put. I went out through the garage door to avoid making noise in the kitchen. The cold hit me the moment I stepped outside. It was a sharp, biting cold that froze the moisture in your nose instantly. The thermometer on the porch wall read 12 degrees below zero. The world was buried under 2 feet of snow. The trees looked like crystal skeletons. My breath puffed out in white clouds as I trudged around the side of the house toward the backyard. The snow was deep. It came up to my knees, making every step a struggle. I had to lift my legs high, marching like a soldier. My heart was pounding, not from the exertion, but from the dread of what I was about to find. I reached the backyard and stopped. I scanned the area. To the untrained eye, it looked normal. Just a white expanse stretching to the wooden fence. But Mrs. Gable was right. You just had to know where to look. Near the old shed, about 20 feet from the back porch, the snow was different. It was not the smooth, wind-swept drifts that nature creates. It was lumpy, uneven. There were ridges and valleys that did not make sense, and there were tracks. They had tried to cover them up, sweeping fresh snow over the tire marks, but the depression in the ground was still visible. Something extremely heavy had been driven in here. I gripped the aluminum snow shovel I had grabbed from the garage. The metal handle was cold even through my gloves. I walked toward the lumpy patch of snow. I felt exposed. If Patrick woke up and looked out the window, he would see me. But I could not stop now. I reached the spot Mrs. Gable had warned me about. I took a deep breath and plunged the shovel into the snow. Clang. The sound was sharp and metallic, echoing in the crisp morning air. I froze, waiting to see if a light would flip on in the house. Nothing happened. I dug faster. I scooped away the top layer of powder. Underneath, there was a heavy canvas tarp. It was gray, designed to blend in with the winter landscape, but the corner had come loose. I hooked the edge of the shovel under the tarp and heaved it back. My stomach dropped. It was not just a pile of scrap metal. It was a beast. Sitting there half buried in my backyard was a brand new Caterpillar XQ125 mobile generator. It was massive, painted in that signature yellow that I had seen on job sites for 40 years. I knew exactly what this machine was. It was a powerhouse capable of running a hospital during a blackout, and I knew exactly how much it cost. $80,000. Minimum. I ran my gloved hand over the cold metal casing. It was flawless. No scratches. No rust. This was not a discarded piece of junk. This was fresh off a dealership lot or stolen directly from an active construction site. I looked at the serial number plate riveted to the side. It had been gouged with a grinder, but I could still read the last 4 digits. This machine belonged to Miller Construction, the biggest outfit in the county. I had seen the news report 2 days ago about a daring theft from their holding yard. My son had stolen an $80,000 generator and parked it in my garden. But that was not the worst of it. I looked to the left of the generator. There was another lump under the tarp. I shoveled the snow away frantically, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Revealed under the snow were 4 55-gallon steel drums. They were blue, and they looked old. Rust was eating away at the rims. I leaned in closer, squinting at the faded labels. Danger. Corrosive. Asbestos waste. I recoiled as if I had been burned. These were illegal chemical waste drums, the kind that you have to pay specialized companies thousands of dollars to dispose of properly. Unscrupulous contractors would sometimes pay cash to shady middlemen to make them disappear. Patrick was not just stealing equipment. He was running an illegal dumping ground. He was taking money to bury toxic waste in the ground. My ground. I looked at the drums again. One of them was dented, and a dark, oily liquid was oozing out of the seal, staining the white snow a sickly brown color. If that stuff got into the groundwater, it would poison the well. It would poison the soil for decades. And since this was my property, I would be the one responsible. The Environmental Protection Agency would not care that I did not know. They would seize my assets. They would fine me $50,000 a day. They would put me in prison for environmental terrorism. I stood there in the freezing cold, feeling the sweat trickle down my back. This was not just a rebellious son acting out. This was a calculated attempt to destroy me. Patrick and Megan had set me up. They wanted me to sign that paper, giving them control of the shed and the yard. Once I signed it, and these things were found, I would take the fall. I would die in a federal prison cell while they collected the insurance money and walked away free. I looked back at the house. It looked so innocent with its snow-capped roof and warm windows, but inside there were monsters sleeping in my guest room. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the shovel. Anger, hot and blinding, surged through my veins. It burned away the fear. It burned away the sadness. I grabbed the tarp and pulled it back over the generator, and the drums smoothing the snow over the top to hide my work. I stepped backward carefully, filling in my own footprints as I retreated. I needed to get back inside before they woke up. I needed to act normal. I needed to let them think their plan was working. Because now I had the evidence. I knew exactly what the game was, and Thomas Strickland does not lose at his own game. I walked back to the garage, my boots crunching softly on the ice. As I closed the door behind me, shutting out the cold and the sight of that yellow metal, I made a decision. They wanted to bury me. Fine. But they forgot one thing. I am the one who owns the shovel. I walked back into the garage and stamped the snow off my boots with deliberate force. I needed the noise to cover the sound of my heart, which was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I took a deep breath of the gasoline-scented air and composed my face. For 40 years, I had negotiated with union reps, building inspectors, and angry clients. I knew how to wear a mask. Today, I needed the best mask of my life. I stepped into the kitchen just as the smell of frying bacon hit me. It should have been a welcoming scent, the smell of family and Sunday mornings, but today it turned my stomach. The warmth of the house felt stifling after the biting cold of the yard. Patrick and Megan were already at the table. The transformation was terrifying. Last night they had been snarling wolves, kicking my dog, and drinking to my demise. This morning, they looked like a picture from a catalog. Patrick was wearing a clean flannel shirt, his hair combed back. Megan was in a soft pink robe, pouring orange juice into crystal glasses. "Good morning, Dad," Patrick said. His voice was bright, almost singing. He stood up and pulled out a chair for me. "You were up early. I heard you outside." I froze for a fraction of a second. He had heard me. I forced a smile that felt tight on my face. "Just checking the gutters," I said. "The storm was rough last night. I wanted to make sure the downspouts were clear." Patrick nodded, seemingly satisfied. He sat back down and piled scrambled eggs onto his plate. He looked rested. He looked happy. It was the happiness of a man who thinks he has gotten away with murder. Megan pushed a plate of toast toward me. "Eat something, Thomas," she said sweetly. "You look pale." I sat down. My hands were hidden under the table, clenched into fists so tight, my knuckles were white. I looked at my son. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy I had held when he scraped his knees, the boy I had paid tuition for even when business was slow. And now he was feeding me toast while a stolen $80,000 machine sat in my backyard waiting to send me to prison. So Patrick, I said, keeping my voice level, I noticed the snow in the yard is a bit disturbed near the shed. Did you move some things in last night? Patrick stopped eating. He exchanged a quick glance with Megan. It was a micro-expression, a split second of calculation. Yeah, actually, he said, putting his fork down. I wanted to talk to you about that. Remember I told you about that new contract? Well, my buddy Steve, you remember Steve, right? He lent me some high-grade equipment to get started. Real top-of-the-line stuff. I nodded slowly. Steve. I knew Steve. Steve was currently doing 3 to 5 years for Grand Theft Auto. Is that right? I said. And what kind of equipment is it? Generators mostly, Patrick said, waving his hand dismissively. Just standard job site power units. Nothing fancy. But they are big, so I had to stash them under some tarps until the weather clears. I did not want to wake you up last night, so we just dropped them off quietly. Quietly. He called a convoy of trucks and digging a pit for toxic waste quiet. I took a sip of coffee. It tasted bitter. Well, I said, you know I am careful about what goes on this property, son. We have strict zoning laws here. Megan chimed in then. Her voice was like syrup, soothing and sticky. Oh, Thomas, do not worry. It is all perfectly legal. Patrick is just trying to get back on his feet. We want to make you proud. We want to show you that he can run a business just like you did. She reached across the table and patted my hand. Her skin was cold. Actually, Patrick said, clearing his throat. That brings me to something. Since the equipment is on your land, and the insurance company is being a pain about liability, they need a signature from the property owner. Just a formality. He reached under the table and pulled out a leather portfolio. He unzipped it and slid a crisp white document across the polished wood table. It stopped right next to my coffee cup. What is this? I asked. Just a standard storage agreement, Patrick said casually, picking up a piece of bacon. It basically says you are okay with me parking the gear there. It protects the equipment if something happens like a tree falling on it. Standard stuff, Dad. You have seen a million of these. I looked at the paper. It was thick, expensive bond paper. At the top in bold letters it read, Property Usage and Liability Waiver. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my reading glasses. I took my time wiping the lenses on my shirt. I wanted them to sweat. I do not sign anything without reading it, Patrick, I said. You know that. He laughed, a nervous little chuckle. I know, Dad, I know. But the insurance agent is coming by at noon. I really need to get this faxed over before then, or I lose the coverage. And without coverage, I cannot start the job. The pressure, the urgency, the classic salesman tactic. I put my glasses on and looked at the text. It was single-spaced, dense legal jargon. Most people would just skim it and sign at the bottom. But I was not most people. I had spent 40 years reading contracts that tried to screw me out of money. I started to read. The first paragraph was innocent enough, just stating that I, Thomas Strickland, was the owner of the property. But as I moved down the page, the language changed. It became specific. Terrifyingly specific. Clause 4, Section B. The property owner acknowledges full custody and control of all materials stored on the premises. Clause 5, Section A. The property owner assumes all liability for any environmental hazards, including but not limited to chemical leakage, soil contamination, and groundwater pollution. My heart skipped a beat. They knew about the drums. They knew exactly what was in them. I read on. Clause 8, Section C. In the event of legal inquiry regarding the provenance of stored machinery, the property owner affirms that said machinery was acquired under their direction and supervision. The room seemed to tilt. The words swam before my eyes. This was not an insurance form. This was a confession. If I signed this paper, I was not just letting him use the yard. I was legally stating that the stolen generator and the toxic waste were mine. I was stating that I was the one who ordered them. I was the one controlling them. They had tailored this document to absolve themselves of everything. If the police came, Patrick could point to this paper and say, "I did not know it was stolen. My dad told me to put it there. Look, he signed right here claiming it is his." If the EPA came with their Geiger counters and chemical sniffers, Patrick could say, "I just parked where my dad told me. I had no idea he was burying poison." Look, he accepted full environmental liability. They were not just using me. They were framing me. They were going to sacrifice me to save themselves. I looked up from the paper. Patrick was watching me intensely. He had stopped chewing. Megan was holding her coffee cup halfway to her mouth, her eyes locked on my face. They were waiting for the pen to hit the paper. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Patrick asked. His voice was tight. I looked at him. Really looked at him. I looked for a trace of the little boy who used to cry when his goldfish died. I looked for the teenager who worked summers carrying lumber for me. I saw nothing. I saw only greed. I saw a man who was willing to send his own father to die in a concrete cell just so he could drive a nice truck and wear a nice watch. I felt a coldness settle over me. It was colder than the blizzard outside. It was the coldness of a bridge burning down. "Everything is fine," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Distant. I reached for the pen Patrick had placed next to the document. I saw his shoulders relax. I saw Megan smile a tiny, triumphant smile. But then I stopped. My hand hovered over the signature line. "Actually," I said, "I need to check something with my accountant first. Clause 6 mentions a tax liability. I do not want this to mess up my pension payments." Patrick's face hardened. "Dad, come on. It is just a standard form. Do not be difficult." "I am not being difficult," I said, standing up. "I am being careful, just like you want me to be." I picked up the document. "I am going to take this into the study and read it over with a magnifying glass." My eyes are not what they used to be. I did not wait for an answer. I turned my back on them. I walked out of the kitchen clutching the paper that was meant to be my death warrant. As I walked down the hall, I heard Patrick whisper to Megan, "Do not worry. He will sign it. He is old. He does not understand what he is reading." I gripped the paper tighter. Oh, I understood perfectly. I understood that the war had just begun. And I understood that for the first time in my life, I was going to have to destroy something I loved to save myself. I walked back into the kitchen, clutching the document that was essentially my death warrant. Patrick and Megan were still sitting there, their eyes following me like hawks watching a field mouse. They expected me to have a pen in my hand. They expected a signature. Instead, I walked straight to the coffee pot. My hands were trembling, and this time I did not have to fake it. The adrenaline coursing through my veins made my fingers twitch. I poured a fresh cup of steaming black coffee, filling it right to the brim. I turned to face them, holding the cup in one hand and the document in the other. "I have a question about Clause 4, I said, my voice wavering just enough to sound like a confused old man. "It says here that the usage is indefinite. Does that mean you are planning to keep the equipment here forever?" Patrick sighed loud and dramatic. "No, Dad. It just means we do not have a specific end date yet. It depends on the weather. Just sign the paper so I can email it." He reached out his hand, snapping his fingers impatiently. I took a step forward. I focused on my wrist. I let my grip on the mug loosen just a fraction. "Whoops," I cried out. The mug tilted. The hot, dark liquid splashed out in a violent arc. It did not hit the floor. It hit the document I was holding directly in the center. The coffee soaked into the expensive bond paper, instantly turning the white sheets into a soggy brown mess. The ink began to bleed, turning the sharp legal text into a blurry watercolor of nonsense. "Oh no," I stammered, dropping the wet paper onto the table. "Look what I did. I am so clumsy today. My hands just will not stop shaking." Patrick jumped up from his chair, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. Jesus Christ, Dad. Look at that! You ruined it! Megan let out a sharp hiss of annoyance, grabbing a napkin to dab at her silk robe, which had caught a few stray drops. Thomas, really? You need to be more careful. That was an important document. I stood there looking down at my shoes, playing the part of the scolded child. I am sorry, I muttered. I do not know what is wrong with me. I think I need to go see Dr. Evans. Maybe my blood pressure is off. Patrick raked his hands through his hair, pacing back and forth in the small kitchen. Great. Just great. Now I have to go all the way back to the office to print another copy. The insurance agent is coming in 2 hours, Dad. 2 hours, well, I said, looking up with innocent eyes. Why do not you go do that? I will go to the pharmacy and pick up my refill. By the time you get back, I will be steady enough to sign. Patrick looked at me. He looked at the ruined paper. He looked at the clock. He was trapped by his own urgency. He could not make me sign a coffee-stained napkin. Fine, he snapped. Go to the pharmacy. But be back here by noon. Do not go wandering off, and do not touch anything in the yard. I promised, I said, grabbing my coat. I will be back before you know it. I walked out to my truck, my heart beating a victory rhythm against my ribs. I had bought myself time. Not much, maybe 3 hours at best, but it was enough. I climbed into the cab of my Silverado and fired up the engine. I backed out of the driveway, carefully making sure to look like a cautious senior citizen. But the moment I turned the corner and was out of sight of the house, I floored it. I did not go to the pharmacy. I drove toward the edge of town to a place called the Rusty Spoon. It was a dive bar that served breakfast, the kind of place where construction workers and truck drivers ate before their shifts. It was dark, it smelled of grease, and most importantly, it was the last place my son would ever look for me. He was too good for places like this now. I parked in the back alley and went in through the service door. The diner was half empty. In the back booth, sitting in the shadows, was a man in a wool suit that looked out of place among the flannel and denim. It was Harrington. James Harrington had been my lawyer for 30 years. We had played poker together every Friday night until my wife passed. He was the only man in this town I trusted with my life. I slid into the booth opposite him. He did not say hello. He just pushed a cup of black coffee toward me and tapped a thick manila folder resting on the table. You look like hell, Tom, he said, his voice gravelly and low. I feel like hell, I replied, taking a sip of the coffee. It burned my tongue, but I welcomed the pain. It made me feel alive. Did you find it, James? Tell me you found something. Harrington looked around the diner, checking for eavesdroppers. Then he opened the folder. I found everything, Tom, and it is worse than we thought. Much worse. He pulled out a stack of papers covered in red ink and highlighted numbers. I ran a credit check on Patrick and his company, he began. Strickland Construction is not just broke, Tom. It is a shell. He has been insolvent for 18 months. He owes suppliers. He owes subcontractors. But that is the easy part. He slid a photo across the table. It was a surveillance shot, grainy and dark. It showed Patrick shaking hands with a man in a suit. I recognized the man, as the song. Everyone in the construction business knew him. Tony Vargo. He ran a concrete supply company that was a front for loan sharking and organized crime. Patrick borrowed $500,000 from Vargo 6 months ago, Harrington said. He thought he could double it on a speculative land deal in Detroit. The deal fell through. The money is gone. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. 500,000. That was why he was desperate. That was why he was stealing generators. He was trying to pay back the mob. But why the insurance fraud, I asked. Why try to frame me? If I go to prison, he does not get the house. The government seizes it. Harrington shook his head grimly. That is where you are wrong, Tom. Look at this. He pulled out a copy of my will and a copy of the deed to my house. But there was another document underneath it, a document I had never seen before. He forged a lien against your property, Tom Harrington explained, pointing to a signature that looked remarkably like mine. But that is not the kicker. The kicker is this clause right here in the trust fund he set up for himself, using your assets as collateral. I put on my glasses and read the highlighted paragraph. Accelerated inheritance clause. In the event of the primary benefactor's incarceration, incapacitation, or death, full control of all assets, real estate, and liquid funds shall transfer immediately to the secondary beneficiary to ensure the continued management of the estate. I lowered the paper. My hands were shaking again, and this time it was not an act. He wants me to go to prison, I whispered. Harrington nodded. Or worse, Tom. If you go to prison for environmental crimes, the EPA freezes the assets, but the control of the company and the remaining equity goes to him. He can sell the house to pay Vargo before the government seizures kick in. He needs you out of the picture. Prison is the clean way. But if you do not sign that paper, if I do not sign, I said, realizing the horror of the situation. He cannot frame me. Exactly, Harrington said. And if he cannot frame you, he cannot pay Vargo. And guys like Vargo do not take IOUs. Patrick is a desperate man, Tom. And a desperate man is dangerous. If he cannot send you to prison, he might try to incapacitate you in other ways. My mind flashed back to the way he kicked Buster. The violence in his eyes. The way Megan looked at me with cold calculation. They were not just trying to steal my money. They were gambling with my life. If I did not sign that liability waiver today, Patrick would have no way to offload the stolen goods onto me. He would be stuck with them. And when Vargo came collecting, Patrick would be the one in the crosshairs. Unless I had a tragic accident, I said, my voice flat. A fall down the stairs. A heart attack in my sleep. Harrington reached across the table and squeezed my arm. You cannot go back there, Tom. It is not safe. We go to the police right now. We show them the forgery. We show them the debts. No, I said, pulling my arm away. Not yet. Harrington looked at me like I was crazy. Tom, are you listening to me? Your son sold your future to the mob. He is waiting for you to die. I know, I said, slamming my fist softly on the table. I know, James. But if we go to the police now with just this financial paperwork, he gets a slap on the wrist for fraud. Maybe a few years. He will be out in 2. And he will still hate me. He will still come after me. I stood up. I need to nail him, James. I need to catch him in the act. I need to make sure he goes away for a long time. For the theft. For the toxic waste. For everything. I am going back, I said, buttoning my coat. Tom, that is suicide, Harrington hissed. No, it is a trap, I replied. But this time I am the one setting it. I looked down at the folder. Keep these papers safe, James. If anything happens to me, you give them to the sheriff. But give me tonight. I have a plan. I walked out of the diner and back into the cold. The snow was falling again, covering the world in white. I drove back toward my house, toward the son who wanted me dead. I was not afraid anymore. The sadness was gone. All that was left was the cold, hard resolve of a man who had one last job to finish. I checked my watch. 11:45. I was right on time for the next act. I drove straight to an electronics supply store on the south side of town, the kind of place that does not have a sign out front and sells equipment to private investigators and paranoid ex-husbands. I did not go to a big box store where the cameras are white plastic blobs that scream surveillance. I needed something invisible. I bought a set of 6 pinhole cameras disguised as standard Phillips head screws. To the naked eye, they looked exactly like the hardware holding up a light switch or a vent cover. But inside the head of that screw was a high-definition lens that transmitted video and audio directly to an app on my phone. I sat in my truck down the street from my own house watching the driveway. I had to wait. If I went in now and started unscrewing faceplates while they were home, they would get suspicious. I drank the rest of my cold coffee and waited. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the garage door opened. Patrick backed his truck out. Megan was in the passenger seat applying lipstick in the vanity mirror. They looked like a power couple heading to a lunch date, but I knew they were probably going to meet their buyers to finalize the deal for the stolen generator. As soon as they turned the corner, I made my move. I pulled into the driveway and hurried inside. I had maybe an hour. I went into work mode. My body remembered the rhythm of the job site. I moved with efficiency and precision. I started in the kitchen. I removed the top screw from the light switch plate near the refrigerator and replaced it with one of the camera screws. It was a perfect match. I did the same in the living room, placing one high up on an air vent to get a wide-angle view of the sofa and the front door. I went out to the back porch. This was the most important one. I found a loose board on the siding that faced the shed and the spot where the toxic drums were buried. I drilled a tiny pilot hole and screwed the camera in. It looked like just another old rusty screw holding the siding together. But now I had a 24/7 view of the crime scene. I synced the cameras to my phone. The picture was crystal clear. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I could see the dust motes dancing in the light. My house was now a trap, and I was the spider waiting in the center of the web. I retreated to my study upstairs and locked the door. I sat in my leather chair and put on my headphones. I waited. Around 2:30, I heard the front door open. They were back. I opened the app on my phone. The feed from the living room camera flickered to life. Patrick walked in first, pacing back and forth. He looked agitated. He was running his hands through his hair, a nervous tic he had since he was a kid. Megan followed him in. She threw her expensive handbag onto the sofa and pulled out her phone. She did not look agitated. She looked bored. "Relax, Patrick," she said, walking into the kitchen. The camera there picked her up clearly. She was pouring herself a glass of wine. "It is going to be fine. Vargo said the trucks are coming tonight. Once the stuff is gone, we get the cash and the debt is cleared." Patrick leaned against the counter. "Yeah, but what about the old man? He almost saw the drums this morning, Megan. If he goes out there tonight—" Megan laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound. "He is not going to go out there. He is a clueless old fool, Patrick. Did you see him this morning spilling his coffee like a geriatric patient? He is losing it. His hands shake, his eyes are bad. He is practically halfway in the grave already." I gripped the armrests of my chair. Hearing it was different than suspecting it. Megan took a sip of wine and dialed a number on her phone. "Hey," she said into the receiver, her voice shifting instantly to a flirtatious purr. "Yeah, it is me. No, everything is on schedule. We have the heavy equipment ready for pickup at 2 a.m. And the waste disposal unit. Yes, all 4 barrels. She paused, listening to the person on the other end. "Do not worry about the owner," she said, looking up at the ceiling, almost directly at where I was sitting. "He is a non-issue. We have the liability waiver ready. Even if he does not sign it tonight, we will just forge it. Who is going to believe a senile 70-year-old over a grieving son?" She laughed again. "Yeah, exactly. He will be in a nursing home or the ground by next month anyway. We are already looking at brochures for Shady Acres, the cheap wing." I took the headphones off. My hands were not shaking anymore. I felt a cold calm settle over me. They were not just bad kids. They were monsters. They were planning to dispose of me just like they were disposing of that toxic waste. I sat there for a long time watching the screen in silence. I watched them eat my food. I watched them sit on my furniture. I watched them plot my destruction. At 5 o'clock, there was a knock on my study door. Dad, are you in there? Patrick called out. I put the phone in my pocket and composed my face. I opened the door. Patrick was standing there, smiling. It was his salesman smile. Hey, Dad, listen, something came up. I have some very important investors coming over tonight. Top-tier guys from Chicago. We need to go over the blueprints for the high-rise project, and it is going to get loud. Lots of arguing, lots of smoke. It is going to be boring as hell. He paused, waiting for me to take the bait. I was thinking, he continued. Maybe it would be better if you stayed at Aunt Clara's place tonight, just so you can get some peace and quiet. You know how you hate cigar smoke. It was the perfect excuse. Get the old man out of the house so the criminals can bring their trucks in. I looked at him. I looked at the son I had raised. You know that is a good idea, Patrick, I said. My head is still pounding. A quiet night at Clara's sounds wonderful. She has that heated blanket I like. Patrick's shoulders sagged with relief. Great. That is great, Dad. I will help you pack a bag. You should probably head out soon. We need to set up the conference room downstairs. Conference room. He meant the command center for his illegal operation. I grabbed a small duffel bag from the closet. I threw in a few shirts and my toothbrush. I moved slowly, playing the part. Patrick hovered in the doorway, watching me, making sure I was actually leaving. Do not worry about the house, Dad, Patrick said as I zipped up the bag. We will take good care of it. I know you will, son, I said. I know you will. I walked down the stairs. Megan was in the living room. She did not even look up from her magazine. Bye, Megan, I said. See you, Thomas, drive safe, she muttered. I walked out the front door and into the cold evening air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow. My truck was waiting in the driveway. I threw the bag into the passenger seat. I climbed in and started the engine. Patrick was standing in the doorway watching me leave. He waved. I waved back. I backed out of the driveway and drove down the street. I drove slowly, like an old man who was afraid of the ice. I drove until I turned the corner and was out of sight. But I did not go to Aunt Clara's house. Aunt Clara lived in Lansing, 2 hours away. I drove 3 blocks over to Mrs. Gable's street. I pulled into her driveway, which had been cleared by the plow service I paid for secretly every winter. I turned off the engine. I turned off the lights. I sat there in the dark and pulled out my phone. The screen glowed, illuminating my face. On the screen, I saw my living room. Patrick was high-fiving Megan. They were celebrating. They thought the coast was clear. I watched them for a moment. Then I reached into the glove box and pulled out a pair of high-powered binoculars. I am not going anywhere, I whispered to the empty truck. I got out and walked toward Mrs. Gable's back door. She was expecting me. We had a long night ahead of us, and I had a front-row seat to the show that was about to begin. Mrs. Gable's kitchen smelled of lavender and old paper. It was a stark contrast to the cold fury burning in my gut. I sat by the window in her darkened spare bedroom, which offered a perfect line of sight to my backyard. Mrs. Gable sat beside me in a floral armchair, clutching a pair of heavy marine binoculars that had belonged to her late husband. We looked like a pair of birdwatchers waiting for a rare migration, but the predators we were watching were my own flesh and blood. You were right, Martha, I said, keeping my voice low. I should have listened to you sooner. She adjusted the focus on her lenses. Do not blame yourself, Thomas. Snakes are good at hiding in the grass, or in this case, the snow. We sat in silence as the hours ticked by. The digital clock on the bedside table read midnight, then 12:30. My phone was propped up on the windowsill, streaming the feed from the hidden cameras inside my house. I could see Patrick pacing the living room, checking his watch every few minutes. Megan was on the couch, scrolling through her phone, looking bored. They were nervous. They knew the window of opportunity was closing. At exactly 1 in the morning, the headlights appeared. They did not come down the main street. They came through the service alley that ran behind the properties, a narrow dirt road meant for utility trucks. I saw the beams of light cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the snow-covered trees. "Here they come," Mrs. Gable whispered, her grip tightening on the binoculars. I raised my own pair. A massive flatbed truck rolled slowly into view. It was black with no company logo on the door. The license plate was covered with a layer of mud that looked deliberate. Behind it was a smaller box truck, the kind used for moving furniture, but it sat low on its suspension, indicating a heavy load. They pulled directly into my backyard, crushing the pristine snow and the dormant hydrangeas my wife had planted years ago. The audacity of it took my breath away. They were driving heavy machinery right over my lawn, treating my property like a criminal salvage yard. I looked at the phone screen. Patrick jumped up from the sofa. "They are here," he said. "Let's get this over with." He and Megan grabbed their coats and hurried out the back door. I shifted my gaze back to the window. I watched as my son ran up to the driver's side of the flatbed. A large man stepped out. Even from this distance, I could see he was built like a tank wearing a thick parka. They exchanged a few words. Patrick pointed toward the shed, toward the spot where the Caterpillar generator was hidden. "They are moving the generator," I whispered. "They are selling it tonight." But they did not load the generator immediately. Instead, the driver of the box truck got out and walked to the back of his vehicle. He rolled up the rear door. "What is that?" Mrs. Gable asked, leaning forward. I squinted through the lenses. Two men jumped out of the back of the truck. They were not moving equipment. They were carrying shovels and pickaxes. Why do they need shovels if they are just picking up the generator? I asked myself. The men marched toward the far corner of the yard near the property line, where the old oak tree stood. This was a different spot from where the toxic drums were buried. This was a spot I had never touched, a quiet corner that I had planned to turn into a gazebo one day. They started digging. The ground was frozen solid, but these men were professionals. One of them started up a gas-powered auger, a loud mechanical drill that bored into the earth. The sound was muffled by the wind and the distance, but to me it sounded like a scream. "What are they doing, Thomas?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice trembling. "Why are they digging a new hole?" I watched the screen on my phone. Megan was standing on the porch supervising. She was holding a clipboard. She shouted something to the men pointing at the hole. "Deeper," she seemed to be saying. "Make it deeper." A cold realization washed over me. They were not just selling the stolen generator. That would have been too simple. They were using the generator sale as a cover for something else, something they needed to get rid of permanently. The men worked fast. Within 20 minutes, they had a pit that was maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet long. It looked ominously like a grave. Then the men went back to the box truck. They did not bring out machinery. They dragged out a long, heavy object wrapped in thick, black industrial plastic. It was roughly the size of a person, or perhaps a collection of smaller, heavy items taped together. They struggled with the weight of it. It took 3 of them to carry it across the snow. My heart hammered against my ribs. What is in that bag? Is it a body? Did they kill someone? I zoomed in with the binoculars, trying to find a tear in the plastic, trying to see a shape. It was lumpy and rigid. They reached the edge of the pit and unceremoniously dumped the object in. It hit the bottom with a dull thud that I felt in my bones. Patrick walked over to the edge of the hole. He looked down into it. For a moment he hesitated. He looked almost sick. But then Megan walked up behind him. She put a hand on his shoulder and whispered something in his ear. He straightened up. He nodded. He grabbed a shovel and threw the first pile of dirt onto the black plastic. "They are burying evidence," I said, my voice raspy. "Whatever is in that bag connects them to something much worse than theft, and they are burying it in my yard so that if it is ever found, I am the one who goes down for it." Mrs. Gable lowered her binoculars. She looked pale. Thomas, we have to call the police. Now. This has gone too far. No, I said, gripping her arm. Not yet. If the police come now, they might claim they were just burying trash. They might claim I ordered them to do it. I need to know what it is, and I need them to finish. I need them to think they have won. I watched as the men filled the hole, packing the dirt down tight. Then they did something that chilled me to the core. They rolled the heavy Caterpillar generator over the top of the fresh grave. They were not selling the generator. They were using it as a tombstone. They were hiding the new burial site underneath the stolen machine. No one would think to dig under an $80,000 piece of equipment. It was the perfect hiding place. The truck's engines revved. The men climbed back into their cabs. Patrick and Megan stood in the snow watching them leave. They high-fived. They think it is over, I whispered. They think the secret is buried. I turned to Mrs. Gable. Her hands were shaking. Do you still have that old police scanner? I asked. She nodded, pointing to the shelf. Turn it on, I said, and get the phone. I am going to make a call. But not to 911. I am calling the one person who hates Patrick almost as much as I do right now. Who is that? She asked. The man he stole that generator from, I said grimly. Miller Construction, and tell them to bring their excavators. We are going to do some landscaping. I looked back out the window. The yard was quiet again. The snow was falling, covering the tracks, covering the fresh dirt, covering the sins of my son. But snow melts, and when it does, the rot underneath is revealed. They had dug a hole in my yard tonight, but they did not realize they had just dug their own graves, and I was about to push them in. I kept the binoculars pressed against my eyes until the rims dug into my skin. My breath fogged up the cold glass of Mrs. Gable's window, but I did not dare wipe it away for fear that the movement would catch their eye. Down in the yard, the operation had shifted from theft to something far more sinister. The men had finished with the generator. Now they were unloading the cargo from the smaller box truck. They rolled the first drum to the edge of the pit. It was heavy. It took 2 men pushing with all their might to get it through the snow. The drum was painted a dull industrial blue, but even from this distance I could see the orange diamond-shaped warning labels plastered on the side. I zoomed in, adjusting the focus wheel with a trembling finger. The symbol was unmistakable. It was the biohazard sign. The 3 interlocking circles that warned of infection and death. Then they rolled out the second drum and the third. These were different. They were older and rusted at the seams. I saw the word asbestos stenciled in white paint that was peeling off. My stomach turned over. I knew exactly what was happening. In the construction industry, getting rid of hazardous waste is the most expensive line item on any budget. To dispose of asbestos and medical waste, legally, you have to hire certified specialists. You have to pay thousands of dollars per ton. You have to fill out mountains of paperwork that track the waste from the demolition site to the incinerator. But if you are a crooked contractor, like the people my son was dealing with, you find a cheaper way. You find a desperate idiot with a secluded property and a hole in the ground. You pay him a fraction of the cost, and you bury the poison where no one will find it. Patrick was not just storing equipment. He was turning my home into a toxic landfill. I watched as they tipped the first drum into the hole. It tumbled down, hitting the black plastic bag they had buried earlier. The sound was a dull boom that vibrated through the frozen ground. I prayed the seal would hold. If that drum split open, if that medical waste or liquid asbestos seeped into the soil, it would be a catastrophe. I am not talking about a simple cleanup. I am talking about the Environmental Protection Agency declaring my property a Superfund site. They would come in with their white suits and their Geiger counters. They would fence off the entire neighborhood. They would excavate every inch of dirt down to the bedrock, and the bill for that cleanup would come to me. I did the math in my head. Federal fines for illegal dumping of hazardous materials start at $50,000 per day per violation, plus the cost of remediation, which could run into the millions. I would lose the house. I would lose my pension. I would lose every dime I had saved for 40 years. And then I would go to federal prison for environmental terrorism. At my age, a 10-year sentence was a death sentence. Patrick was not just stealing my present, he was erasing my future. He was burying me alive under those drums. The men worked quickly. They rolled all 4 drums into the pit. Then they started shoveling the dirt back in. They covered the poison. They covered the crime. And then they did the smartest and cruelest thing of all. They used a winch on the back of the flatbed truck to drag the massive stolen Caterpillar generator over the top of the fresh dirt. They positioned it perfectly. The heavy machine sat right on top of the buried drums. It was the perfect camouflage. If anyone came looking, they would just see a generator parked on the snow. They would never think to look underneath it. And the weight of the machine would pack the dirt down, making it look like it had been there for months. The workers packed up their shovels. The trucks rumbled to life, sending plumes of diesel smoke into the clean night air. They began to back out of the yard, their tires crunching over the destruction they had caused. Patrick and Megan stood in the middle of the yard watching them go. The red taillights of the trucks illuminated their faces. They looked euphoric. They were laughing. Megan did a little dance spinning around in the snow, her expensive boots kicking up white powder. She wrapped her arms around Patrick's neck and kissed him. It was a kiss of victory. They had done it. They had cleared the debt. They had framed the old man. They were free. I lowered the binoculars for a second, feeling a wave of nausea. I wanted to look away. I wanted to stop watching, but I forced myself to look back. I needed to see it all. I needed to fuel the fire that was starting to burn in my chest. Patrick pulled a flask from his coat pocket. He took a long swig and passed it to Megan. Then he looked around the yard, as if he was the king of the world, surveying his kingdom. He said something to Megan and pointed toward the side of the house near the trellis. I frowned. That was the rose garden. My late wife had planted those roses 30 years ago. They were her pride and joy. Even in the winter, I kept the bushes carefully mulched and wrapped in burlap to protect them from the frost. Every summer they bloomed with the most beautiful red flowers you have ever seen. When she died, I spent hours out there tending to them. It was where I went to talk to her. It was sacred ground. Patrick knew that. He knew how much those roses meant to his mother. He knew how much they meant to me. I watched through the lenses as Patrick walked over to the garden. He was unzipping his pants. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I thought maybe he was checking something. Maybe he was fixing the burlap. But then I saw the stream of steam rising in the cold air. He was urinating on his mother's roses. He was laughing as he did it. His head was thrown back, and his shoulders were shaking with mirth. Megan was standing a few feet away, giggling, covering her mouth with her gloved hand. He finished and zipped up his pants. Then he turned and kicked the nearest bush. The frozen branches snapped with a dry crack. He kicked it again and again, stomping the mulch into the snow, destroying the protective wrapping, exposing the roots to the killing freeze. Something inside me broke. It was not a loud break. It was not a scream. It was the sound of a steel cable finally snapping under too much tension. For the last 24 hours, I had been operating on fear. Fear of prison. Fear of losing my money. Fear of my son. But in that moment, the fear evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hard hatred that was absolute. He had stolen from me. I could forgive that. He had tried to frame me. I could perhaps understand the desperation. But this desecration of his mother's memory, this casual cruelty, this was unforgivable. He was not my son anymore. He was a cancer. And you do not negotiate with cancer. You do not reason with it. You cut it out. I watched him walk back to the house arm in arm with his wife, stepping over the grave of toxic waste he had just dug. He looked so confident. He thought he was untouchable. I put the binoculars down on the windowsill. My hands were perfectly steady now. Mrs. Gable was looking at me. She had seen it too. She had seen him desecrate the garden. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with shock. "Thomas," she whispered, "we have to call the police. Right now, before they go back inside." I turned to her. My face felt like it was carved from stone. "No, Martha," I said. "The police are for criminals. These two are worse than criminals." I picked up my phone. I closed the camera app. I did not need to see any more. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I had saved earlier. It was the emergency line for the Environmental Protection Agency regional office. And after that, I had the personal cell number of the CEO of Miller Construction, which I had obtained from my old union contacts. "I am not just going to report them," I said, my voice low and devoid of any emotion. "I am going to bury them." I looked out the window one last time at the dark shape of the generator sitting like a tombstone in my yard. Patrick wanted a war. He wanted to play in the dirt. Well, he was about to find out that when you play in the dirt with a man who has moved Earth for 40 years, you end up getting buried. I pressed the call button. "Let's bring the house down." I switched apps on my phone. My thumb hovered over an icon that looked like a small green water droplet. Patrick thought I was a dinosaur. He thought I was a senile old man who could barely operate a television remote. He often mocked me for refusing to get rid of my old flip phone for years. But what he did not know was that 6 months ago I had upgraded the entire property. I had installed a state-of-the-art smart home system. I controlled the locks, the lights, the thermostat, and most importantly, the high-pressure commercial irrigation system I used to keep my prize-winning lawn green during the dry Michigan summers. The system was connected to a dedicated well pump that pushed 50 gallons a minute at 80 pounds per square inch. It was powerful enough to knock a man down, and right now the sprinkler heads were buried under 2 feet of snow, dormant and forgotten. Or so they thought. Patrick and Megan were still in the yard waving at the departing trucks. The drivers were revving their engines, eager to get their illicit cargo out on the road. The rear wheels of the flatbed were spinning slightly on the packed snow, trying to find traction. I looked at the temperature gauge on Mrs. Gable's wall. It was now 15 degrees below zero. At that temperature, water does not just freeze. It turns into a weapon. I tapped the screen. Zone all. Duration continuous. Activate. I watched through the window. For a second, nothing happened. The system had to pressurize. Then the ground exploded. 24 hidden sprinkler heads popped up through the snow crust simultaneously. They did not spray a gentle mist. They unleashed a torrent of icy water. The jets blasted into the air, turning instantly into a freezing slurry as they hit the sub-zero wind. It looked like a geyser field erupting in Antarctica. Down in the yard, chaos broke out instantly. The water hit the windshields of the trucks, blinding the drivers with a sheet of instant ice. It soaked Patrick and Megan, who screamed and scrambled toward the porch, slipping and falling as the snow under their feet turned into a slushy, treacherous mess. But the real target was the driveway. The narrow path the trucks had cleared was now being flooded with gallons of water every second. The water hit the frozen earth and the packed snow and triggered a phenomenon known as flash freezing. It created a layer of black ice so smooth and so hard it was frictionless. The driver of the lead flatbed truck panicked. He was blinded by the water hitting his glass. He did the worst thing you can do on ice. He slammed on the brakes. The laws of physics took over. A 40-ton truck carrying heavy machinery does not stop on ice. It becomes a sled. The wheels locked up. The back end of the truck swung out violently. It began to slide sideways down the slight incline of the driveway, picking up speed. The driver fought the steering wheel, but he was no longer a driver, he was a passenger on a runaway train. Behind him, the driver of the box truck tried to swerve to avoid the jackknifing flatbed. He turned the wheel hard to the left. His front tires caught a patch of fresh ice, and the truck pirouetted like a ballerina. It spun a full 360 degrees, smashing into the oak tree with a sickening crunch of metal and glass. But the flatbed was the main event. It continued its sideways slide completely out of control. It smashed into the stone pillars of my front gate, the gate I had built by hand. The impact was thunderous. The stone exploded, sending debris flying into the night. The truck tilted. Gravity did the rest. With a groan of twisting steel, the massive vehicle tipped over onto its side. It landed with a ground-shaking crash directly across the entrance to the driveway. The stolen generator strapped to the bed groaned against its chains, but held. The truck lay there like a dead whale, effectively building a steel wall across the only exit. The engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out. Silence returned to the yard, broken only by the aggressive hiss of the water sprinklers, which continued to pump gallons of water over the wreckage, sealing everything in a tomb of ice. I looked at my phone and pressed stop. The water cut off. The mist settled. The scene below was a masterpiece of destruction. The driveway was blocked. The trucks were wrecked. The ground was a skating rink of death. I saw Patrick crawling on his hands and knees on the porch. He was soaked to the bone. In these temperatures, hypothermia would set in within minutes if he did not get inside. He was screaming something incoherent, grabbing the railing and trying to pull himself up. Megan was huddled by the door, pounding on it, trying to get in, but she had dropped her keys in the snow. The drivers were climbing out of their wrecked cabs. They slipped and fell hard onto the ice. They tried to stand and fell again. It was impossible to walk. They were trapped. I watched one of the men, the big one who had supervised the burial of the waste, try to run toward the fence. He took 2 steps, his feet went out from under him, and he landed flat on his back, sliding 20 feet down the driveway until he hit the overturned truck. They were not going anywhere. I picked up the binoculars again. I zoomed in on Patrick's face. He was shivering violently. His expensive coat was ruined. His hair was frozen into icicles. He looked terrified. He looked at the wrecked trucks, and then he looked up at the dark windows of the house. He looked confused. He could not understand what had happened. Why had the sprinklers turned on? Why now? Then he looked around wildly, as if sensing he was being watched. He looked toward the street. He looked toward the trees. And then for a brief second, his gaze swept over Mrs. Gable's house. I did not duck. I sat there in the dark, staring right back at him. He could not see me, but I could feel his panic. He knew this was not an accident. He knew the timing was too perfect. He pulled his phone out of his pocket with trembling fingers, probably to call for help, or to call his criminal boss Vargo to explain why the shipment was not coming. But the phone slipped from his numb hands. It hit the icy porch and skittered away, sliding off the edge and disappearing into a snowdrift. He screamed a sound of pure frustration and fear. I lowered the binoculars. Mrs. Gable was staring out the window, her mouth slightly open. "Remind me never to make you angry, Thomas," she whispered. I stood up. My knees popped. I felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind you feel after a long day of hard, honest work. "They are trapped," I said. "The police will be here in 10 minutes. And Miller Construction's security team will not be far behind. They are going to find a yard full of stolen equipment, illegal waste, and wrecked trucks. And they are going to find my son right in the middle of it all." I walked over to the closet and grabbed my coat. "Where are you going?" Mrs. Gable asked. "I am going home, Martha," I said, buttoning up my jacket. "I need to make an entrance." I walked out to my truck. The air was frigid, but I did not feel the cold. I drove the short distance to my house. I did not turn on my headlights. I parked at the end of the street just as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. Blue and red lights began to flash against the snow, reflecting off the ice in my yard. It was a beautiful sight. I watched as the police cruisers struggled to get up the icy slope. They had to park on the street. Officers spilled out, slipping and sliding guns, drawn shouting orders. I saw them surround the yard. I saw them handcuff the drivers who were still trying to crawl away on the ice. I saw them drag Patrick and Megan off the porch. It was time. I put my truck in gear and drove slowly toward the chaos. I was the grieving father returning from a visit to his sick sister, only to find his home destroyed. That was the role I had to play. But as I looked at the wreckage of my front gate and the toxic glaze of ice covering my land, I knew that the role of the victim was over. Tonight, I was the judge, and the verdict had already been delivered. I pulled my truck up to the curb just outside the perimeter of the police tape. The scene before me looked like a carnival of nightmares. The red and blue emergency lights reflected off the sheets of ice covering my front yard, creating a strobe effect that was dizzying and violent. The siren wails had died down, replaced by the crackle of police radios and the shouting of officers trying to maintain their footing on the treacherous surface I had created. I took a moment to check my reflection in the rearview mirror. I needed to look like a confused elderly man returning from a family visit, not a mastermind who had just orchestrated a tactical takedown. I messed up my hair slightly and let my shoulders slump. I opened the door and stepped out into the biting wind, letting the shock on my face be genuine. "Officer," I called out, waving my hand weakly. "What is happening?" "That is my house. Where is my son?" A young deputy tried to stop me, but then Sheriff Turner saw me. Jim Turner and I went back 20 years. We had fished together. We had shared beers at the local lodge. He was a good man, but he was a lawman first and a friend second. He walked over to him, his face grim and unreadable under his wide-brimmed hat. He was moving carefully, his boots crunching on the gravel, because the driveway was impassable. "Tom," he said, his voice heavy, "you need to stay back. We have a situation here." "Jim, what is going on?" asked, my voice trembling just enough. "I saw the trucks. Is Patrick okay? Was there an accident?" Turner looked at me, and for the first time in 20 years, I saw suspicion in his eyes. It cut me deeper than the cold wind. "Your son is alive, Tom," he said. "But we found a lot more than just a truck accident. We found a stolen generator from the Miller job site. And we found indications of illegal hazardous waste dumping. The EPA is already on their way." I put a hand to my chest, feigning a heart palpitation. "Stolen. Hazardous waste. Jim, that is impossible. Patrick is a good boy. He is just trying to restart his business." Turner did not comfort me. He stepped aside and pointed toward the squad cars parked near the ruined front gate. "You better ask him yourself," he said. I looked past him. Patrick and Megan were standing by the hood of a cruiser. They were not in handcuffs yet. They were wrapped in emergency blankets, shivering violently from the water and the freezing air. But they were talking. They were talking fast and loud to a detective who was taking notes. As soon as Patrick saw me, his face twisted. It was not fear. It was a mask of betrayal so perfect it would have won an award. "There he is," Patrick screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "That is him. That is the man who made us do it." I stopped in my tracks. I looked at Turner. What is he talking about? The detective walked over to us. He was holding a plastic evidence bag. Inside it was a piece of paper. It was dry and crisp. It was not the coffee-stained mess I had left on the kitchen table. "Mr. Strickland," the detective said, his voice cold. "Your son claims that he was acting under your direct orders. He claims that you forced him to store this equipment here and that you threatened to cut him out of the will if he did not comply." "That is a lie," I said, my voice rising. "That is a complete lie." "Is it?" the detective asked. He held up the bag. "We found this in your son's truck. It is a liability waiver and a statement of ownership. It clearly states that Thomas Strickland assumes full custody and control of all materials stored on the premises, including industrial machinery and chemical disposal units. And it is signed. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was my name. The loops of the T and the S were perfect. It looked exactly like my handwriting. Patrick had spent hours practicing it. I had seen him on the camera, but seeing the result now in the flickering police lights was terrifying. "He forged it," I said, looking at Turner. "Jim, you know me. You know I would never get involved in something like this." Turner looked at the ground, then back at me. "I want to believe you, Tom. I really do. But your son tells a different story." I looked over at Patrick. He was putting on the performance of his life. He was crying now, great heaving sobs that shook his shoulders. He was clinging to Megan, who was wiping tears from her eyes, looking like a terrified victim. "He is sick, officer," Patrick wailed loud enough for everyone to hear. "My father has been losing his mind for years. He hoards things, he gets paranoid. He made me steal that generator because he said the government was coming to shut off the power. He made us bury those drums because he said the soil needed medicine. We tried to stop him, but he got violent. Look at what he did to the yard. He turned on the sprinklers to try and kill us." Megan chimed in, her voice shrill and desperate. "He has a gun in the house. He threatened to shoot us if we went to the police. We were just trying to protect him from himself. Please, you have to believe us. We are the victims here." The lies poured out of them like vomit. They took every truth and twisted it. They took my preparation and called it paranoia. They took my justice and called it madness. And the worst part was that it was working. I saw the way the officers were looking at me. They saw an old man living alone in a big house. They saw the strange trap set with the sprinklers. They heard the crying son. It fit the narrative. The crazy old coot who lost his marbles and dragged his family down with him. Turner placed a hand on his belt near his handcuffs. "Tom," he said softly, "I need you to turn around. I need to pat you down for weapons." My heart hammered against my ribs. They were going to arrest me. They were going to put me in the back of a car while my son walked free. The forged document gave them probable cause. The story about my mental health gave them a motive. I looked at Patrick. He was not crying anymore. He was watching me over the shoulder of the deputy. A tiny smirk played on his lips. It was a look of pure triumph. He thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the old dinosaur. I raised my hands slowly. I felt the rough hands of the sheriff patting down my coat. He found my wallet. He found my keys. "Is this it?" Turner asked. "No gun." "I do not own a gun, Jim," I said quietly. "You know that. I gave my hunting rifle to your brother 5 years ago." Turner paused. He remembered. Doubt flickered in his eyes again. Patrick saw the hesitation. He shouted again. "He hides it. It is under the floorboards. He is dangerous, officers. Do not let him near us." The detective looked at Turner. "Sheriff, we have a signed confession of ownership here, and we have witness testimony stating he is the ringleader. We need to take him in. We can sort out the mental health evaluation later." Turner looked at me with sadness. "I am sorry, Tom. Until we can verify the authenticity of this document, I have to detain you. The EPA is going to want a head on a platter for those drums, and right now your name is the only one on the paper." I felt the cold steel of the handcuffs click around my wrists. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of my life falling apart. Patrick let out a loud sob of relief, burying his face in Megan's shoulder. "Thank God," he said. "Thank God you got him before he hurt anyone else." I stood there, the wind biting into my face, watching my son celebrate my arrest. He had done it. He had flipped the board. He had used my own house against me. But as the officer began to lead me toward the cruiser, I did not struggle. I did not scream. I walked with my head high. Because Patrick had made one fatal mistake. He thought the only eyes watching this yard were the eyes of the police. He forgot that I had spent the afternoon installing 6 other eyes that never blinked, eyes that recorded every word, every smirk, and every lie. I stopped by the door of the police car. "Sheriff?" I said, my voice calm and steady, cutting through the wind. Turner stopped. "What is it, Tom?" "Before you put me in this car," I said, "I think you should know that I watched the whole thing happen." Turner sighed. "Tom, we know you were here. The neighbors saw your truck." "No, Jim," I said. I watched it from the inside." I nodded toward the house, toward the dark windows where the tiny screw heads were hidden. "And if you check my coat pocket, you will find my phone. And on that phone is a cloud recording of the last 12 hours. You will see who dug the hole. You will see who drove the trucks. And most importantly, you will see my son sitting at my kitchen table practicing my signature for 3 hours while laughing about how he was going to send me to prison." Patrick stopped crying instantly. His head snapped toward me. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. Turner froze. He looked at me, then he looked at Patrick. He reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "Unlock it, Tom," he said. I gave him the code. 1972. The year my son was born. Turner tapped the screen. He opened the app. He pressed play. The silence in the yard was heavy. Everyone was watching the sheriff's face. I saw the blue light of the screen illuminate his eyes. I saw his expression change from fatigue to shock and then to a burning anger that matched my own. He watched for a full minute. Then he looked up. He did not look at me. He looked at Patrick. And this time there was no doubt in his eyes, only disgust. Turner slowly closed the phone and handed it to the detective. "Uncuff him," he said, pointing to me. Then he turned to his deputies and pointed at Patrick and Megan. "And cuff them, double lock it, and read them their rights, every single one of them." Patrick screamed. It was a primal sound of a trapped animal. "No, that is fake. He doctored it. It is a deep fake, but it was too late. The trap had snapped shut, and the rat was finally caught." The silence that followed the playing of the video was heavier than the snow piling up outside. The wind was still battering the walls of the house, but inside the air felt sucked out of the room. I took the phone back from Sheriff Turner. His face was a mask of cold fury. He did not look at me. He was looking at the man he had known since he was a boy, the man who was now revealed to be a snake. "Bring them inside," Turner said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "I want to see this on a bigger screen, and I want everyone to see it." The deputies grabbed Patrick and Megan by the arms. They were not gentle this time. They dragged them up the icy steps and into the living room. I followed them. My wrists felt light without the handcuffs, but my heart felt like a stone in my chest. I walked into my own house. It was warm inside. The smell of the pizza they had eaten earlier was still lingering in the air, mixed with the expensive perfume Megan wore. It made me sick. James Harrington was waiting for us in the hallway. I had texted him the moment the police arrived. He stood there in his wool coat holding his briefcase like a shield. He did not say a word. He just nodded to me, a sharp, curt nod that said, "I have your back." We all gathered in the living room. Patrick and Megan were shoved onto the sofa, the same sofa where they had plotted my demise just hours ago. They were shivering, wet, and pathetic. Their expensive clothes were ruined by the mud and the water. Megan's mascara was running down her face in black streaks, making her look like a melting doll. I walked over to the 60-inch television mounted above the fireplace. Patrick had bought this TV with my credit card 2 weeks ago, claiming he needed it for presentations. He was right. He just did not know he would be the star of the show. I tapped my phone, connecting it to the screen. The image flickered to life. It was high definition, crystal clear. The room went silent again. On the screen, we saw the kitchen. It was bright and sunny. We saw Patrick sitting at the table with a stack of papers. We saw him holding a pen, his tongue sticking out in concentration. And we heard him. "Okay, watch this, Megan," he said on the video. "I have got the tremble down perfectly. Look at the T. It is shaky, just like the old man's." We watched as he signed my name over and over again. We watched him hold up the forged document, admiring his work like an artist. "This is it," he said, laughing. "This is the golden ticket. Once he signs this, or we say he signed it, we are in the clear. The EPA can dig all they want. It will all blow back on him." I looked at Patrick sitting on the sofa. He was staring at the screen, his mouth open, his eyes wide with horror. He looked like he was watching his own funeral. I swiped to the next video. This one was Megan. She was pacing the living room holding a glass of wine. "He is so stupid," she said to someone on the phone. "He actually believes we are broke. We have 300 grand stashed in the Cayman account, and once the insurance pays out on the house after he goes to prison, we will be set for life." I paused the video. The image of Megan's face, twisted in a cruel sneer, was frozen on the screen, towering over the real Megan, who was now sobbing into her hands. I turned to face them. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a foreman running a job site. "You called me stupid," I said. "You called me senile. You thought because I walk slow and my hands shake that my mind was gone. You thought you could come into my house, eat my food, and bury your poison in my yard." I took a step closer to Patrick. "But you forgot one thing, son. You forgot who taught you how to build. You forgot who taught you how to read a blueprint. You looked at the surface. You looked at the snow. You never thought to check the foundation." Patrick looked up at me. His face was pale, the color of old ash. His lips were trembling. "Dad," he whispered. "Dad, please." It was just talk. We were just blowing off steam. We did not mean it. "Do not lie to me," I snapped. The sudden sharpness of my voice made him flinch. "Do not you dare lie to me. Not anymore. I watched you. I watched you kick my dog. I watched you piss on your mother's roses. I watched you dig a grave in my backyard." I pointed at the screen. "That is not talk, Patrick. That is conspiracy. That is fraud. That is elder abuse. And that is a confession." Harrington stepped forward then. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a file. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dry and professional. "In addition to the video evidence, we have bank records showing unauthorized transfers from Thomas's accounts to shell companies owned by Patrick. We also have the original will and the fraudulent lien Patrick attempted to file against this property. This was a premeditated RICO enterprise operating out of this house." Turner nodded. He looked at his deputies. "Read them the full charges," he said. As the deputy began to recite the list of crimes, grand larceny, forgery, environmental endangerment, conspiracy to commit fraud, something snapped in Patrick. The reality of his situation hit him like a wrecking ball. The money was gone. The freedom was gone. The lies were exposed. He was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He let out a roar. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of a cornered beast. He launched himself off the sofa. He was fast. Desperation gave him speed. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat, his eyes burning with a murderous hate. "You old bastard!" he screamed. "You ruined everything." I did not move. I did not flinch. I stood my ground. But he never reached me. 2 deputies tackled him mid-air. They hit him hard, driving him into the coffee table. Glass shattered, wood splintered. Patrick thrashed and kicked, screaming obscenities, foaming at the mouth. "I will kill you!" he shrieked as they pinned him to the floor. "I wish you were dead. I wish you had died instead of Mom." The words hung in the air, breathless and terrible. The deputies wrenched his arms behind his back, forcing the handcuffs tighter until he cried out in pain. They hauled him to his feet. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. He looked wild feral. Megan was screaming in the corner, curled up in a ball, begging for a lawyer, begging for mercy, claiming she was forced to do it. I looked at my son. I looked at the blood running down his face. I felt a profound sadness wash over me. But it was not the sadness of regret. It was the sadness of loss. The boy I loved was dead. He had died a long time ago. This man in front of me was a stranger. "Take them away," Turner said, disgusted. "Get them out of my sight." "Wait," I said. The room froze. The deputies stopped dragging Patrick toward the door. Patrick looked at me, panting heavily, blood dripping into his eye. He thought maybe I was going to show mercy. He thought maybe the old man was going to crack. I walked up to him. I stood inches from his face. I could smell the sweat and the fear on him. "You think this is over?" I asked softly. "You think the video is the end of it?" Patrick stared at me, confusion clouding his rage. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out a set of keys. Not the house keys, not the truck keys. I held up the master key to the Caterpillar generator. "You were so worried about the generator, Patrick," I said. "You were so worried about the drums. You thought that was the only secret in the yard." I leaned in close so only he could hear me. "But I know what you buried in the other hole, son. I know what is under the snow near the property line. The hole you dug 3 months ago. The one you thought I forgot about." Patrick's eyes went wide. His pupils dilated until his eyes were almost black. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He stopped breathing. I smiled. It was a cold, hard smile. "Sheriff," I called out, turning to Turner, "before you take them downtown, there is one more thing you need to see. You might want to call the heavy excavation unit." "What is it?" Tom Turner asked. "What else is there?" I looked back at Patrick. He was shaking his head, pleading with his eyes, begging me not to say it. I walked to the window and pointed to the far corner of the yard, the dark spot under the old oak tree. "My son likes expensive cars, Sheriff," I said. "He likes them so much he thinks he can bury them to claim the insurance and then dig them up later." I turned back to Patrick, who was now sagging in the officer's arms, his legs giving out. "Let's go dig up the Porsche, Patrick," I said, "and let's see what else you decided to bury with it." The scream Patrick let out then was not anger. It was pure terror, because he knew that the Porsche was not just insurance fraud. The Porsche was the key to something much darker. And I was about to hand that key to the world. Sheriff Turner ordered his deputies to drag Patrick and Megan back out into the freezing night. They kicked and screamed, trying to dig their heels into the expensive rugs they had bought with stolen money, but it was no use. I walked ahead of them, putting on my heavy work gloves. The wind was still whipping across the yard, but the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world silent and white, waiting for the final secret to be revealed. We walked past the overturned flatbed truck and the flooded driveway, where the ice was glistening like black glass under the police strobes. I led them toward the far corner of the property line near the old oak tree that had stood there since before I was born. This was the spot I had mentioned to Patrick inside the house. This was the spot where the snow was perfectly smooth, undisturbed by the chaos of tonight. To the naked eye, it looked like just another patch of winter lawn. But I knew better. I knew that 3 months ago, Patrick had borrowed my backhoe, claiming he needed to dig up a dead tree stump. I had let him do it because I trusted him then. I did not watch him then. But I remembered how nervous he was when I came home early that day. And I remembered how quickly he had covered the hole and planted fresh grass seed, even though it was late autumn. Miller Construction's recovery team had arrived with their heavy equipment to retrieve their generator. I signaled to the operator of a large excavator, a man I recognized named Davis. I pointed to the ground beneath the oak tree. "Dig here," I said, my voice cutting through the wind. "And be careful. You are not digging up dirt. You are digging up a felony. Davis nodded and tracked the massive machine forward, the metal treads crunching over the frozen earth. The hydraulic arm raised up like a prehistoric beast, and the bucket curled, ready to strike. Patrick let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. No. You cannot do this. This is private property. You need a warrant, Sheriff. Turner looked at him with cold eyes. We have probable cause, son. And right now your father is giving us permission. Dig it up. The bucket slammed into the ground. The earth was frozen hard, but the machine was powerful. It tore through the frost line, ripping up chunks of soil and snow. The engine roared, straining against the weight. I stood there with my arms crossed, watching the hole get deeper and deeper. Megan was hyperventilating, her eyes fixed on the pit with terrified fascination. She knew what was coming. She knew that her life of luxury was about to end in a hole in the ground. The excavator took another scoop, and then another. On the fourth pass, we heard it. It was not the sound of stone or wood. It was the sickening screech of metal tearing against metal. It was the sound of glass shattering under immense pressure. Hold it, I shouted. The operator paused, the bucket hovering over the hole. I walked to the edge and shone the flashlight down. Sheriff Turner joined me. Buried about 6 feet down, encased in dirt, and crushed by the weight of the earth, was the roof of a car. It was white, or it had been white before the mud stained it. I waved for the operator to scrape away the remaining dirt. Slowly, the shape revealed itself. It was an SUV, a luxury SUV. Turner jumped down into the hole, sliding on the loose dirt. He wiped the mud off the rear license plate. He looked up at me and then over at Megan. Well, 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 he said. If it is not the white Porsche Cayenne that was reported stolen from the mall parking lot 3 months ago, the one you filed a $100,000 insurance claim for, the one you cried about on the local news. Megan's knees gave out. She collapsed into the snow, sobbing uncontrollably. It is amazing, I said loud enough for everyone to hear, how a car that was stolen by a gang of professional thieves ended up buried 6 feet deep in the owner's father's backyard. It is almost like someone wanted the insurance money to pay off gambling debts, but was too cheap to actually destroy the car. I looked at Patrick. He was staring at the ground, defeated. The fight had left him. He was just a hollow shell of a man waiting for the end. But Megan was not done. When she heard the mention of the insurance money, something in her snapped. She stopped crying. She looked up and her face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred. She scrambled to her feet and lunged at Patrick. You idiot, she screamed, clawing at his face with her manicured nails. You said you crushed it. You told me you took it to the compactor. You said no one would ever find it. The deputies had to pull her off him. She was screaming like a banshee, spitting and cursing. You useless coward. You could not even do this right. I told you we should have just poisoned him. I told you we should have just pushed him down the stairs. But no, you wanted to be smart. You wanted the inheritance. Now look at us. The silence that followed that admission was deafening. Even the police officers looked shocked. She just admitted to conspiracy to commit murder, Turner said quietly. He motioned to his deputies. Get them out of here. Now. They dragged them toward the squad cars. Megan was still screaming, blaming Patrick, blaming me, blaming the world. Patrick was silent, tears streaming down his face, mixed with the blood from where his wife had scratched him. As they shoved Patrick into the back of the cruiser, he looked back at me one last time. Through the wire mesh of the window, our eyes met. He looked like a frightened child waiting for his father to save him. He mouthed the word Dad. I looked at him. I looked at the son I had raised, the son I had loved, and I felt nothing. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel pity. I just felt a cold, empty space where my heart used to be. I turned my back on him. I watched as the convoy of police cars began to navigate down the slippery street, their red and blue lights fading into the distance. I stood alone in my ruined yard. My gate was destroyed. My garden was dead. My lawn was a toxic hazard. And my family was gone. Mrs. Gable walked up to me, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. "It is over, Thomas," she said softly. I looked at the hole where the Porsche lay crushed and broken. I looked at the hole where the poison was buried. "Yes," I said. "It is over." I took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. It hurt my lungs, but it felt good. It felt like freedom. I had lost a son, but I had saved myself. And as I looked at the first rays of dawn starting to break over the horizon, I knew that I would rebuild. I always did. I was Thomas Strickland, and I was still standing. The blue and red lights finally faded into the distance, leaving me standing alone in the ruins of what used to be my life. The wind had died down, but the air was still biting cold. My front gate was a pile of rubble. My yard was a crime scene taped off with yellow plastic that snapped in the breeze. My house, the place where I had raised a family and built a future, was now just a building. The soul of it had been dragged away in handcuffs. I walked back inside. The silence was deafening. For years I had complained about the quiet of living alone, but this was different. This was the silence of a tomb. I walked into the kitchen and saw the coffee stain on the table where I had spilled my cup earlier that day. It seemed like a lifetime ago. I grabbed a rag and wiped it up. Then I went to the fridge and threw out the rest of the pizza. I threw out the wine. I threw out everything that reminded me of them. I did not sleep that night. I spent the hours until dawn sitting in my armchair watching the sun slowly rise over the snow-covered trees. It was a beautiful morning. The sky was a piercing blue. It was the kind of day that makes you glad to be alive. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly alive. I was not a victim. I was a survivor. I called Harrington at 9 o'clock sharp. I told him to put the house on the market. I did not care about the appraisal. I did not care about holding out for the best offer. I wanted it gone. I wanted to liquidate the assets before the memories choked me. The legal fallout was messy but manageable. Because I had self-reported to the EPA and cooperated fully with the investigation, they were lenient. I had to pay a significant fine for the cleanup of the toxic waste, but it did not bankrupt me. I sold the land to a developer who planned to tear the house down and build condos. I signed the papers without a second thought. Watching the excavator tear down the walls of my old bedroom did not make me sad. It felt like I was shedding an old skin. With the house sold and the fines paid, I was left with a healthy nest egg. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to live. Enough to be free. I did not move into a condo. I did not move into a retirement community where I would play bingo and wait to die. I went to the dealership on the highway and bought a 40-foot Class A motorhome. It was a beast of a machine with a king-sized bed, a full kitchen, and an engine that could climb mountains. It was a house on wheels, a house that could not be invaded because it never stayed in one place long enough. 2 weeks after the arrest, I parked the RV in front of Mrs. Gable's house. The engine purred with a low, powerful rumble. I walked up her driveway. The snow was melting now, turning into slush under my boots. The spring thaw was coming. I knocked on her door. Martha opened it wearing her faded gray cardigan. She looked at me, and then she looked past me at the massive vehicle parked on the street. Her eyes went wide. "Thomas," she said. "What is that?" "That is my new address, Martha," I said, smiling. "I am heading south. I hear the weather in Florida is beautiful this time of year. No snow, no ice, and definitely no snakes." She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that made her look 10 years younger. "That sounds wonderful, Thomas. I will miss our birdwatching sessions." I looked at her. Martha had been alone for 10 years. Her kids never visited. She spent her days staring out the window waiting for something to happen. She had saved my life with a whisper in a grocery store. I was not going to leave her behind. You do not have to miss them, I said. I have an extra bunk, and I could use a navigator. I am not as sharp with a map as I used to be. Martha stared at me. She looked at her empty, quiet house. Then she looked at the open road waiting outside. Tears welled up in her eyes. Are you serious, Thomas? She asked. I am dead serious, I said. Pack a bag, Martha. We are leaving in an hour. 45 minutes later, she walked out the door with a suitcase and her cat carrier. She locked her front door, and she did not look back. We drove out of town just as the sun was hitting its peak. We passed the county jail on the way to the highway. I did not slow down. I did not look at the barbed wire fences or the concrete walls. My son was in there awaiting trial. He would have a public defender. He would have 3 meals a day. He had made his bed, and now he had to sleep in it. I turned onto the interstate and pushed the gas pedal down. The RV surged forward. The road stretched out before us, endless and open. For years, I had defined myself by what I provided. I was a father. I was a builder. I was a provider. I thought that if I gave enough, if I sacrificed enough, I would be loved. But I learned the hard way that you cannot buy loyalty and you cannot build a foundation on quicksand. I looked over at Martha. She was tuning the radio, humming along to an old country song. She looked happy. I realized then that family is not just about whose DNA you share. Family are the people who warn you when there is danger. Family are the people who stand by you in the dark. Family are the people who respect you. I thought about the message I would leave for anyone else trapped in a situation like mine. Anyone else who feels like they are being drained dry by the people they are supposed to trust. Children are flesh and blood, but dignity is the backbone. You can lose a lot of blood and survive. You can get a transfusion. You can heal. But if you break your backbone, you never stand up again. You spend the rest of your life crawling. I chose to stand. I checked the side mirror one last time, watching the town of Grand Rapids disappear behind us. The snow was gone. The road ahead was dry and clear. I am Thomas Strickland. I am 72 years old, and my life is just beginning. This story teaches us a brutal but necessary truth about boundaries. We often cling to toxic relationships simply because they are family, believing that shared blood mandates endless forgiveness. But there is a difference between being a supportive parent and being a victim. Thomas showed us that protecting your peace and your future is not an act of selfishness, it is an act of survival. When the people you love weaponize your kindness against you, you have the right to disarm them. Respect is not a given, it is earned, and sometimes the only way to win the war is to walk away from the battlefield entirely. If this story made you think about your own worth, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had to make a tough decision to protect yourself from a family member? Tell me your story in the comments below and let me know which city you are tuning in from. I read every single one. Stay strong, stay safe, and never let anyone break your backbone. See you in the next video.